Have you ever wondered what it takes to fall so far that the cold, hard ground becomes your only bed? What kind of pain could strip a man of everything, yet leave him clinging to a single hidden piece of his past? And what happens when the world forgets a hero, but he can't forget the war that broke him? This is a story of a man who slept on the frozen asphalt of a forgotten alley for 10 years, with a Medal of Honor tucked beneath his tattered shirt, right over a heart that refused to stop, beating even when hope seemed long gone. In the heart of Detroit, where the bitter Michigan wind howls through abandoned lots and the ghosts of Motown linger in the cracked pavement, there's a narrow alley off Woodward Avenue, barely wide enough for a dumpster to fit. Here, under the flickering amber glow of a dying streetlight, you'd find Johnny Carver, curled up on a bed of cardboard and despair. His weathered face, etched with lines deeper than the potholes on I-94, tells a story of battles fought, some on foreign soil, others within himself. His hands, rough as the rusted steel of the old Ford plants, tremble as they clutch a thin blanket, patched together from Goodwill rejects. But beneath the grime and the unshaved stubble, there's a flicker in his steel-gray eyes, a quiet defiance, like the last embers of a campfire refusing to die in the dead of winter. The faint jingle of dog tags under his shirt, paired with the distant rumble of a passing semi-truck, echoes a life lost to time. Johnny doesn't speak much, not to the stray cats that slink by or the occasional passerby tossing a quarter. But if you looked close, you'd see the scars, some on his skin, others buried so deep they only surface in the nightmares that jerk him awake, gasping for air on that unforgiving ground. Johnny's days blur into one gray, endless loop, as predictable as the rumble of the people mover overhead. He wakes with the first bite of dawn, when the alley smells of damp concrete and yesterday's regret. His bones ache from the cold that seeps through the cardboard, a chill that's nothing compared to the frost in his soul. He shuffles to the corner store, old boots scuffing against the sidewalk, trading loose change for a styrofoam cup of burnt coffee, just to feel something warm for a fleeting moment. The cashier, a gruff man named Marvin, barely looks at him, just slides the cup over with a grunt. Johnny nods, a silent transaction of survival. Back in the alley, he watches the city wake up. Kids in Detroit Lions hoodies hustling to school, factory workers with lunch pails trudging to the last standing plants, and suits barking into phones on their way to Renaissance Center. He's invisible to them, just another shadow on the margins of the Motor City. But there's a weight he carries, heavier than the hunger gnawing at his gut. It's in the way his fingers instinctively brush against his chest, where something cold and metal rests against scarred skin. It's in the way his eyes dart to the sky at the sound of a low-flying plane, body tensing like he's back in the desert, waiting for the next explosion. He mumbles sometimes, half words lost in the wind, names maybe, or apologies to ghosts only he can see. Johnny's fighting a war no one else can hear, and every day he loses a little more ground. He's been at this for a decade, 10 long years since he traded a soldier's uniform for the uniform of the unseen. Torn jackets, mismatched gloves, and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't wash off. Most nights, he sits with his back against the brick wall, staring at the graffiti that reads "Keep Pushing" in faded red paint, as if it's a personal message from a world that's moved on. He's tried to piece himself together, odd jobs here and there, shoveling snow in the brutal winters, hauling scrap when his back could take it. Once, he even stood in line at the VA hoping for help, only to be met with forms and wait lists longer than the lines at a Coney Island diner on game day. So, he stopped asking, stopped hoping. But there's something in him that won't let go, something that keeps him from turning to the bottle like so many others on these streets. It's not pride, not anymore, it's a promise. A quiet, unspoken vow he made to someone somewhere, in a time before the alley became his world. Some days he'll pull out a crumpled photo from his pocket, edges worn thin from a decade of touch, and just stare at it until the streetlight dims. He never smiles, but his eyes soften, like he's seeing a life that could have been. A backyard barbecue, a kid's laughter, the smell of fresh-cut grass on a 4th of July evening. Then he tucks it away again, back to the dark because remembering hurts more than the cold ever could. Most mornings, Johnny blends into the rhythm of the alley, unnoticed, just another piece of the city's broken machinery. He sits cross-legged near the dumpster, carving sticks with a dull pocket knife to pass the time, wood shavings dusting the ground like snowflakes that never melt. He listens to the hum of Detroit, a city that's been down but never out, much like him. The distant wail of sirens, the clatter of bottles from the bar across the street, the gospel hymns spilling from a nearby church on Sundays. It's the soundtrack of his exile. He shares the alley with a tabby cat he's named Sarge, a scrappy little thing with one torn ear who curls up near him for warmth. They don't talk, but there's a camaraderie in their shared silence, two outcasts weathering the same storm. Sometimes a food truck rolls up near Cass Corridor, and if Johnny's lucky, the driver, a kind-eyed woman named Ruby, slips him a leftover hot dog or a half-eaten bag of fries. "Gotta keep your strength up, hun," she says with a southern drawl that reminds him of better days, of diner pies and sweet tea on sticky summer nights. He mutters a thanks, head bowed, because looking people in the eye feels like inviting questions he can't answer. But beneath the routine, there's a crack in his armor, a fracture that widens with every passing year. It's in the way he winces at the sound of fireworks on Independence Day, ducking low as if mortars are raining down again. It's in the way he avoids the military surplus store on Gratiot Avenue, unable to face the mannequins in fatigues that mock the man he used to be. Whatever he's running from, it's closer than the shadows in the alley, and it's only a matter of time before it catches up. This morning started like any other, with the sharp sting of November air slicing through Johnny's threadbare jacket as he stirred from a restless sleep. Sarge was already up, pawing at something near the dumpster, tail flicking with lazy curiosity. Johnny groaned, joints creaking like an old Chevy on its last legs, and dragged himself upright. He fumbled for his coffee change, counting nickels and dimes with cracked, dirt-streaked fingers, ready to make the trek to Marvin's store. The alley was quiet, save for the rustle of a plastic bag tumbling in the wind and the distant bark of a junkyard dog. He was halfway to his feet when Sarge let out a low, guttural meow, the kind that meant something was off. Johnny turned, squinting through the gray haze of early dawn, and saw the cat nudging at a small, crumpled bundle near the edge of his cardboard bed. At first, he thought it was just trash, another burger wrapper or a beer can tossed by some late-night reveler. But as he shuffled closer, his breath caught in his throat like a shard of ice. It wasn't trash. It was a child's drawing, folded in half, the edges smudged with dirt but still bright with crayon scribbles. A stick-figure soldier under a yellow sun, holding a flag with stars and stripes. And scrawled at the bottom, in shaky, oversized letters, were the words, "Thank you, hero." Johnny's knees buckled, not from the cold, but from a weight far heavier. His calloused fingers trembled as they unfolded the paper fully, revealing a name written in the corner. His name, Johnny C., in the same childish handwriting. His chest tightened, the metal hidden beneath his shirt, burning against his skin like a branding iron. How could anyone know? How could a kid, some random soul, leave this here, in this forgotten crack of the city, where no one even knew he existed? His eyes, hardened by years of burying pain, glistened with something he hadn't felt in a decade, something raw and dangerous, threatening to unravel the walls he'd built around himself. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the alley was empty, just him and Sarge and the ghosts of a past he couldn't outrun. That drawing, that name, it wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a key, unlocking a door he'd bolted shut long ago, and whatever was on the other side was about to change everything. Johnny sat there, the child's drawing trembling in his dirt-streaked hands, the crayon sun glaring back at him like a spotlight he couldn't escape. His breath came in shallow, jagged bursts, each one scraping against the raw edges of a wound he'd thought long scabbed over. "Thank you, hero." The words clawed at him, sharper than the November wind cutting through the alley off Woodward Avenue. Hero. He hadn't heard that word in years, hadn't felt it in even longer. His steel-gray eyes, usually hard as the frozen asphalt beneath him, blurred with something wet and unfamiliar. He blinked it away fast as if ashamed of the weakness. But his chest, heavy with the weight of that hidden medal of honor, ached like it might crack open right there. How could someone know his name? How could a kid with their clumsy handwriting and innocent hope pierce through the decade of numbness he'd wrapped around himself like a shield? He crumpled the paper slightly, not out of anger, but out of reflex, as if crushing it could crush the memories flooding back. Memories of sand and smoke, of screams he couldn't silence, of faces he'd failed to save. His fingers brushed against the metal under his tattered shirt, the cold metal tethered to a past he'd tried to bury in this Detroit alley. But guilt, that old familiar shadow, crept closer, whispering in the rustle of dead leaves skittering across the ground. He wasn't a hero. He was a ghost, a shell of a man who'd let down everyone who'd ever counted on him. The drawing wasn't a gift. It was an accusation. He didn't move for a long time, just sat hunched over on his cardboard bed, Sarge the tabby cat watching with unblinking eyes as if sensing the storm inside him. The alley felt tighter now, the brick walls pressing in, the distant hum of Detroit's morning traffic a mocking reminder of a world that kept turning while he stayed stuck. His mind churned, replaying fragments of a life he'd tried to forget, boots crunching on desert gravel, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the split-second decisions that haunted him more than any bullet ever could. Who left this drawing? Why now, after 10 years of being invisible, did someone see him? Really see him? The paranoia gnawed at him, mixing with a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. Maybe it wasn't random. Maybe someone out there remembered him, cared enough to reach into this forgotten crevice of the city. But that thought scared him more than the loneliness ever had, because if someone remembered, they might expect something from him, something he didn't have left to give. He tucked the drawing into his pocket next to the worn photo he carried like a lifeline and pressed his back harder against the brick wall, as if it could hold him together. But the cracks in his armor were widening, and every creak of his bones, every shiver from the cold, felt like a countdown to something he couldn't control. By midday, the alley wasn't safe anymore, not from the ghosts the drawing had unleashed. Johnny forced himself to his feet, joints protesting, and shuffled toward Marvin's corner store, needing the burn of that cheap coffee to ground him. The bell above the door jangled as he stepped in, the fluorescent lights harsh against his weathered face. Marvin, behind the counter, glanced up from his newspaper, his usual grunt of acknowledgement replaced with a squint. "You look like hell, Carver." Worse than usual. Johnny kept his head down, sliding his nickels and dimes across the counter, muttering, "Just the coffee." But Marvin didn't move to pour it. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on the counter, his voice low but pointed. "Saw a kid round here yesterday asking questions. Little girl couldn't have been more'n 10, wanted to know if I knew a soldier named Johnny. Figured she meant you, but I ain't said nothing. What's that about?" Johnny's hand froze midair, the coins clinking softly as they slipped from his grip. A little girl, asking for him. His throat tightened, the air in the cramped store suddenly too thick to breathe. "Don't know," he rasped, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "Don't know any kids." Marvin raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into his weathered face, but he just shrugged and poured the coffee. "Well, she seemed real set on finding you. Left something in the alley, I reckon. Kids these days always meddling." Johnny snatched the styrofoam cup, the heat barely registering through his calloused palms, and turned for the door without another word. But Marvin's voice followed him. "Whatever you're running from, man, might be catching up." The bell jangled again as Johnny stepped back into the cold, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Back in the alley, the drawing burned a hole in his pocket, and Marvin's words echoed like gunfire in his mind. He couldn't sit still, couldn't blend into the gray rhythm of his exile anymore. He paced, boots scuffing against the cracked pavement, Sarge trailing behind like a wary shadow. Every rustle of trash, every distant shout from Cass Corridor made him flinch, half expecting that little girl to appear out of nowhere, eyes wide with questions he couldn't answer. What did she want with him? What did she know? The questions churned with darker memories, flashes of a tiny hand clutching his in the chaos of a war zone, promises he couldn't keep, a letter he'd never sent. He stopped pacing, breath clouding in the frigid air, and leaned against the graffiti-scarred wall, the faded "keep pushing" mocking him. Pushing where? He'd been running for so long, from the VA, from people, from himself, that he didn't know how to stop. But the drawing, the little girl, it was an obstacle he couldn't outrun. It was a mirror, forcing him to look at the man he'd become, a man so far from the soldier on that crayon page that it hurt to breathe. And worse, it stirred something he'd buried deep, the need to be seen, to matter, even if it meant facing everything he'd lost. That afternoon, as the weak winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the alley, Johnny found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He walked beyond his usual haunts, past the corner store, past the food truck where Ruby sometimes parked, all the way to the edge of downtown Detroit. The Renaissance Center loomed in the distance, its glass towers glinting like a promise he'd never reach, a symbol of a city reborn while he stayed broken. His boots crunched on grit and salt, each step heavier than the last, until he stopped at a small, weathered mailbox near a boarded-up storefront. He stood there, staring at it, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the drawing and the photo weighing him down. He hadn't written a letter since before the alley, since before the cold ground became his bed. But in his mind he saw it. A letter he'd started 1,000 times, words scratched out in the dark of nights when the nightmares wouldn't let him sleep, words to a family he'd left behind, to a sister who probably thought he was dead, to a niece he'd never met. Was that who the drawing was from? A niece grown now searching for an uncle who'd vanished after the war? The thought hit him like a punch, stealing the air from his lungs. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the crumpled paper, and pulled it out again. "Thank you, hero." The letters blurred as his vision swam, not from the cold, but from a surge of shame so deep it felt like drowning. He didn't deserve thanks. He didn't deserve to be found. But the mailbox stood there, rusted and unyielding, a silent challenge to do something, anything, before it was too late. As he lingered by the mailbox, a shadow fell across the pavement, and a voice cut through the hum of the city. "Johnny? Johnny Carver?" He spun around, body tensing like he was back in combat, ready to bolt. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a scarf wrapped tight against the wind. She held a small stack of flyers, her gaze searching his face with a mix of hope and disbelief. "It is you. I've been looking everywhere. I'm Lisa, from the vet outreach down at the church. Someone's been asking about you. A kid. Says she's got family tied to you. Drew a picture. Left it in alleys all over town, hoping to find you." Johnny's stomach twisted, his grip on the drawing tightening until the paper crinkled. He wanted to deny it, to say she had the wrong man, but the words wouldn't come. Lisa stepped closer, her voice softening. "She don't know the whole story, just bits and pieces her mom told her. But she's got this idea you're some kind of war hero, saved lives. She just wants to meet you, to say thank you in person." Johnny's jaw clenched, the metal under his shirt burning against his skin. Saved lives. If only she knew how many he didn't save. How many ghosts followed him into this alley every night. He shook his head, voice rough and barely above a whisper. "I ain't nobody's hero. Tell her she's got the wrong guy." Lisa's face fell, but she pressed a flyer into his hand, the paper crisp against his rough palm. "Think on it, Johnny. She's at the community center near Hart Plaza tomorrow. Just showing up don't mean you gotta say yes to anything." He didn't look at the flyer, just stuffed it into his pocket with the drawing and turned away, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. But Lisa's words clung to him, a tether pulling at the parts of him he'd tried to bury. That night, back in the alley, Johnny couldn't sleep. The cardboard felt harder, the wind sharper, and Sarge's quiet presence wasn't enough to dull the noise in his head. He sat with his back against the brick, the drawing and the flyer laid out in front of him like evidence in a trial he couldn't win. The child's clumsy soldier stared back, yellow crayon sun shining on a version of him that didn't exist. The flyer listed a time and place, tomorrow 3 p.m., a chance to face whoever was searching for him. His fingers traced the edges of the worn photo in his pocket, the one he never showed anyone, of a little girl on a swing, laughing under a summer sky. His niece, or at least she had been before he'd walked away from everything after the war. Was it her? Had 10 years turned that toddler into the kid leaving drawings in alleys? The thought was a knife, twisting deeper with every heartbeat. He hadn't just lost his life to the streets, he'd stolen a piece of hers, disappearing without a word. Too broken to be the uncle she deserved. The guilt was suffocating, heavier than the hunger, colder than the ground. But beneath it a flicker burned. Maybe not hope, but a need, raw and urgent, to know if she was okay, to see if he'd done more damage than he realized. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, willing the ache to stop, but it only grew. A tidal wave of what-ifs crashing over him. The next morning, Johnny woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, though it came with a fear that gnawed at his bones. He couldn't stay in the alley, not today, not with the weight of that drawing and Lisa's words pressing down on him. He had to decide. Keep running, keep hiding behind the invisibility of his exile, or face the past he'd fled from. The cold bit into his skin as he folded the drawing and the flyer into his pocket, his hands shaking not just from the temperature but from the choice looming ahead. He trudged out of the alley, past Marvin's store, ignoring the grunt of recognition, and kept walking until the city opened up before him. Hart Plaza was close, the heart of Detroit's waterfront, where the Detroit River glittered under a pale winter sky, a place where the city gathered for festivals and protests, a symbol of resilience he'd long stopped believing in. He stopped at the edge of the plaza, the community center visible just beyond the Fountain of Hope, its circular design a nod to the cycles of struggle and renewal. People milled about, families, workers, kids chasing each other despite the chill. Johnny stood there, a shadow among the living, his heart a drumbeat of dread and longing. What would he say if it was her? How could he look into eyes that might hold forgiveness he didn't deserve? The medal under his shirt felt like a lie, a badge of honor for a man who'd abandoned everything that mattered. He checked the crumpled flyer one last time, the time staring back at him. 3 p.m. It was almost here. His boots scuffed the pavement, each step toward the center heavier than the last, as if the river itself was pulling him back. But he couldn't turn around, not this time. Something in him, maybe that quiet, unspoken vow he'd made all those years ago, pushed him forward, even as fear clawed at his chest. He stopped just outside the glass doors of the community center, breath fogging in the air, and caught his reflection in the window. A stranger stared back, hollow-cheeked and worn, nothing like the soldier in that crayon drawing. For the first time in a decade, he wondered if there was anything left of that man to salvage. He reached for the door handle, fingers trembling, then pulled back, the weight of the choice crushing him. Go in, face the girl who might be his niece, and risk unraveling every wall he'd built to survive. Or walk away, back to the alley, back to the cold ground and the safety of being forgotten. His hand hovered, caught between two worlds, as a voice inside, one he hadn't heard in years, whispered to keep pushing, just like the graffiti had always said. Before he could decide, the door swung open, and a small figure stepped out, bundled in a bright red coat, her dark hair spilling from under a knit hat. She looked up, eyes wide and searching, clutching another drawing in her mittened hands. Johnny froze, his breath stopping as recognition hit, not her face but her gaze, a mirror of the little girl in his photo, grown now, but still carrying that spark of hope he'd thought he'd snuffed out. "Are you Johnny?" she asked, her voice small but steady, cutting through the noise of the plaza like a blade. His knees nearly gave out, the metal burning against his skin, the guilt and love and fear colliding in a storm he couldn't weather. He opened his mouth, but no sound came, just a ragged exhale clouding between them. She stepped closer, holding out the drawing, a new one. Another soldier under a sun, this time with a little girl beside him. "I've been looking for you forever," she said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with something raw and unguarded. Johnny's hand fell from the door, the choice no longer his to make. Whatever came next, whether it was redemption or ruin, he couldn't run anymore. He took a step toward her, the ground beneath him no longer just cold asphalt, but a bridge to a past he'd have to face, whether he was ready or not. Hey, if Johnny's story is hitting you as hard as it's hitting us, stick around for the final piece of this journey. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this ends. It's gonna be worth it. Johnny stood there, rooted to the icy pavement just outside the community center at Hart Plaza. his breath a ragged fog between him and the girl in the bright red coat. Her question, "Are you Johnny?" hung in the brittle November air, a weight heavier than the metal pressed against his scarred chest. His throat constricted, 1,000 unspoken words clawing to get out, but none made it past his cracked lips. Her eyes, so familiar yet so foreign after all these years, bored into him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, mirroring the little girl from the photo in his pocket, the one he'd held onto like a lifeline for a decade in that cold Detroit alley. He wanted to turn away, to sink back into the anonymity of the streets, but her small step forward, the new drawing trembling in her mittened hands, anchored him in place. His heart thundered, each beat a drum of dread and longing, as the city's distant hum faded into a suffocating silence. He felt exposed, raw, like the wind had stripped away every layer of grime and numbness he'd built to survive. What could he say to her? What could he offer after vanishing from her life, after letting the war and his failures turn him into a ghost? The guilt surged, a tidal wave threatening to drown him right there on the waterfront, but beneath it, a flicker of something else burned. An ache to know her, to see if he'd broken more than just himself by walking away all those years ago. She tilted her head, her dark hair spilling from under her knit hat, and took another tentative step closer, her boots crunching on the salted pavement. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice small but fierce, fighting the quiver that betrayed her nerves. "My mom, she told me about you. She said you were a hero, that you saved people. I've been looking for you since I was little. I drew pictures, left them everywhere I thought you might be." Her words sliced through him sharper than the Michigan wind, each one a reminder of the man he used to be, the man he'd buried under layers of regret and cardboard in that alley off Woodward Avenue. Hero. The word stung, a mockery of the truth he carried, that he hadn't saved everyone, that the faces of the ones he'd lost still haunted his nightmares. His hands, rough and trembling, clenched into fists in his pockets, the edges of the crumpled drawing and the worn photo digging into his palms. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't worth finding, that the uncle she'd imagined didn't exist anymore. But her eyes held him captive, wide and searching, brimming with a forgiveness he didn't deserve. The tension coiled tighter in his chest, a wire pulled to snapping, as he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about her, about what he'd stolen from her by disappearing, about the little girl who'd grown up wondering why he'd left her behind. Emily's gaze dropped to the drawing in her hands, her fingers smoothing out the creases as if the gesture could steady her. "I drew this one last night," she murmured, almost to herself, before holding it out to him with a hesitant hope. The crayon soldier was there again under a bright yellow sun, but this time a little girl stood beside him, her stick figure hand linked with his. "It's us. How I thought we'd be if I found you. Mom says you went away because of the war, because it hurt you. But I thought, maybe if I found you I could help, like you helped people." Her voice broke on the last word, a crack that shattered something deep inside Johnny. His vision blurred, the world swimming as a hot, unfamiliar sting burned behind his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, not since the desert, not since the alley became his prison. But now, standing before this child, his niece, the last piece of family he'd thought he'd lost forever, the walls he'd built crumbled like the decaying brick of his forgotten corner of Detroit. He took a staggering step back, his old boots scuffing against the ground, overwhelmed by the weight of her words, by the innocence of her belief in a version of him that had died long ago. The metal under his shirt felt like a lie burning against his skin, a symbol of honor for a man who'd abandoned everything that mattered. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her to go, to spare her the disappointment of knowing the broken shell he'd become, but the words lodged in his throat like shrapnel. Instead, a rough, broken sound escaped, half a sob, half a plea. Emily's face softened, and before he could pull away, she closed the distance between them, her small arms wrapping around his waist in a hug so fierce it stole what little breath he had left. He froze, his body rigid as if braced for an attack, but her warmth seeped through his threadbare jacket, a stark contrast to the cold ground he'd known for a decade. "I'm sorry," he rasped at last, voice barely audible, the words tasting of ash and regret. I'm so sorry, kid. I shouldn't have left. I thought you'd be better off without me. I couldn't be who I was supposed to be. His hands hovered awkwardly, unsure, before finally resting on her shoulders, trembling, as if touching something sacred he might break again. Emily pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes glistening but resolute. Mom said you might think that, but you're wrong. I needed you. I still do. Even if you're hurt, even if you think you're not a hero, you're my family. The raw honesty in her voice was a blade, cutting through the last of his defenses, leaving him bare and bleeding with a truth he couldn't deny. He'd hurt her by leaving, but staying away hadn't protected her. It had only deepened the wound. Johnny sank to one knee, the cold pavement biting through his worn jeans, bringing himself level with her. His steel-gray eyes, usually hard as the frozen asphalt of his alley, shimmered with unshed tears as he looked into hers, seeing not just the child before him, but the toddler from his photo, the one he'd pushed away to shield her from his darkness. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, voice raw, each word dragged from a place he'd locked away. I don't know how to be anything anymore, but I never stopped thinking about you. Every day, I carried you with me. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out the worn photo, its edges frayed from years of desperate touch, and held it out to her like a confession. Emily's breath hitched as she recognized herself, a tiny version swinging under a summer sky, laughing as if the world hadn't yet known pain. That's me, she whispered, a small smile breaking through her tears. You kept it, all this time. Johnny nodded, unable to speak, the ache in his chest swelling to something unbearable, yet strangely healing. In that moment, under the pale winter sky with the Detroit River glittering behind them, the years of silence and self-imposed exile dissolved, replaced by a fragile, unspoken promise to try, to be there, even if he didn't know how. The confrontation, raw and unguarded, stripped Johnny of the numbness he'd clung to for survival. As Emily clutched the photo in her drawing, her small hand finding his rough one, he felt the shift deep in his bones, a tectonic change he couldn't undo even if he wanted to. He'd spent a decade running from connection, from the risk of failing again. But now, with her beside him, he understood that running hadn't erased the pain. It had only delayed it. The guilt remained, heavy as ever, but it was joined by something new. Purpose. Not the kind he'd known as a soldier, not the kind tied to medals or missions, but a quieter, harder kind. To be an uncle, to mend what he'd broken, even if it took the rest of his life. He stood slowly, his joints protesting, but his shoulders squared in a way they hadn't in years, as if the weight of her forgiveness had given him strength to carry his own burdens. Emily looked up at him, her face a mix of hope and uncertainty, and he managed a small broken smile, the first real one he could remember. Let's go inside, he said gruffly, nodding toward the community center. Get out of this cold. Maybe you can tell me what I've missed. It was a start, a shaky first step, but it was enough for now. In the days that followed, Johnny's world, once confined to the narrow alley off Woodward Avenue, began to expand, inch by painful inch. He didn't return to the cardboard bed that night, nor the next. Instead, with Lisa from the vet outreach's quiet persistence and Emily's stubborn insistence, he found himself at a shelter near downtown, a temporary roof over his head that felt foreign yet necessary. The walls were thin, the cots creaky, but the warmth, so different from the biting chill of the alley, seeped into his bones, a reminder of what he'd forgotten. He started showing up at the community center, not just for Emily, but for the programs Lisa nudged him toward. Group talks with other vets, sessions where he sat silently at first, hands clenched, but listened as others spoke of wars and losses that echoed his own. Emily was there often, her bright red coat a beacon in the gray of winter, dragging him into conversations about school, her favorite books, even the stray cat named Sarge he'd left crumbs for in the alley. He didn't have much to say at first, but he learned to listen, to be present, something he hadn't done since before the desert swallowed him whole. Each small moment, Helping her with a math problem, sharing a hot chocolate from a vending machine, felt like a brick laid in a foundation he'd thought was beyond repair. But transformation didn't come without cost, and Johnny knew he couldn't move forward without letting go of something he'd clung to as tightly as his guilt. Late one evening, after Emily had gone home with her mother, his sister, who he'd yet to face but knew he would soon, he sat alone on the shelter cot, the Medal of Honor in his hands. He'd kept it hidden beneath his shirt for 10 years, a secret tether to a past he both honored and despised, a symbol of courage that felt like a lie every time he looked at it. His fingers traced the cold metal, the engraved words blurred through years of wear, and he felt the weight of the lives it represented, those he'd saved and those he hadn't. Keeping it had been his way of holding on to the soldier he was, but now, with Emily's drawing folded beside him, he saw it for what it had become. A chain binding him to a version of himself that needed to rest. With a shuddering breath, he made his decision. The next day, he walked to a small veterans memorial near Hart Plaza, a quiet spot overlooking the river, where names were etched in stone and flags fluttered in the wind. He knelt before a blank stretch of grass, no name to mark it, just a place for the unnamed burden soldiers carried, and pressed the metal into the earth, covering it with a handful of dirt. It wasn't a burial of his past, but a release, a sacrifice of the weight he'd carried alone, an offering to the ghosts he couldn't save, a silent vow to carry on differently for the living, for Emily. As he stood, the winter sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the memorial, Johnny felt the absence of the metal like a phantom limb, but also a lightness, fragile and unfamiliar. He pulled out the photo of Emily on the swing, the edges worn thin from a decade of desperate touch, and tucked it back into his pocket with her latest drawing. He'd left the alley behind, but not Sarge, who he'd found prowling near the dumpster days later and coaxed to the shelter with scraps of food. The scrappy tabby now curled near his cot each night, a quiet companion in this new, uncertain chapter. Across the river, the skyline of Detroit glimmered, a city of scars and stubborn resilience much like him. Emily's laughter from earlier that day echoed in his mind, a sound brighter than the Motown tunes that once filled these streets, a reminder of what he was fighting for now. Not a war, not a medal, but a family he'd almost lost. He turned from the memorial, boots crunching on the frosted ground, and headed back toward the shelter, each step a small act of defiance against the cold, against the past, against the silence he'd lived in for too long. Time, he realized as he walked, was a battlefield of its own, one where wounds didn't always heal clean, where victories were measured in quiet moments rather than grand gestures. War had taken pieces of him he'd never get back, had turned him into a shadow sleeping on the frozen asphalt of a forgotten alley. But healing, he was learning, wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about finding a reason to keep going despite them. In the bitter Michigan wind, with the ghosts of his past buried beneath the earth and the promise of Emily's tomorrow pulling him forward, Johnny understood that rebeginnings were possible, even for a man who'd thought himself beyond redemption. The silence of his exile was over, replaced by the tentative rhythm of connection, of purpose, of a life he was just beginning to rebuild, one shaky step at a time. If Johnny's journey has stirred something in your heart, if it's reminded you of the power of second chances, please comment below with, "I believe in healing." Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to start again. And if you're as moved as we are, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of resilience and hope. We're in this together.